Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Chris Simpson, Programs Lead at Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center. We are so glad you are all here for another installment of Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center's Book Talk. This virtual series focuses on recently published books related to our work on Holocaust education, defending human rights, and combating anti-Semitism, racism, and other forms of hate. We are excited to have Richard Lowy on this evening's program, who will speak about his book, Kalman and Leopold. For this session, please feel free to keep your videos on, but with your mics muted, just so we don't have any accidental disruptions. This session is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, so folks who are unable to join us today can watch at a later date. You are welcome to submit your questions through the chat, and we will do our best to get to them throughout the program. And I am proud to be joined by my colleague, Robert Sarner, Senior Editor and Writer at the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center and host of Book Talk. On that note, I will hand it over to you, Robert.
Thank you so much, Chris, and good evening, everybody. And thank you for joining us for this latest edition of FSWC's Book Talk series. I'm thrilled to have with us this evening, as our featured guest tonight, author Richard Lowy, who lives in Vancouver, but is actually joining us now live from his boat in Desolation Sound near the Sunshine Coast in British Columbia. We'll be discussing Richard's poignant nonfiction book, as Chris said, Kalman and Leopold, subtitled Surviving Mengelé's Auschwitz. It was published earlier this year. Later in the program, as Chris mentioned, we'll be taking questions from the audience for Richard. So please do use the chat box at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. Before we begin the conversation, I'd like to read a bio of Richard, who has an extremely strong connection and strong personal connection to the subject matter of the book we're about to discuss. Born in Vancouver in 1958, Richard is CEO of Branded Experiences Incorporated, an internationally acclaimed producer and creative director in the global event industry. His career includes collaborations with prominent cultural figures and thought leaders, including Van Morrison, Diana Krall, Malcolm Gladwell, and Chris Hadfield. Those are just a few. Richard's work has been featured at major museums, literary festivals, and commemorative events around the world. After learning of his father's past, he embarked on what would become the most profound and personal project of his life, recounting his father's harrowing Holocaust experience. It first led to Leo's Journey, the story of the Mengele twins, the documentary film directed by Shel Piercy and narrated by Christopher Plummer. In 2001, it was aired worldwide, which in turn led to the unexpected reunion of Richard's father, Leo, or Leopold, with a man named Kalman Baron, who 56 years earlier, Leopold had protected at Auschwitz, where the two were young boys from Hungary and fellow so-called Mengele twins. That highly emotional reunion would ultimately inspire Richard to write Kalman and Leopold, based largely on their respective testimonies. We're going to get to the discussion in a moment, but first of all, it's my pleasure to welcome Richard to this evening's edition of Book Talk. And I want to thank you, Richard, for being here with us to make time with us.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Before we actually start discussing your book, Richard, given where you're speaking to us from, why don't you first treat us to a very brief view of the magnificent surroundings from your boat, which is your home for the summer?
Sure. Not sure how many people have ever heard of this place before, but it's called Desolation Sound, and it's up the coast of British Columbia, about 100 nautical miles north of British Columbia. And we're in a bay right now called Prito Haven. Give you a feel for it. I'll try not to fall off the aft here. I don't know if you can see that.
Magnificent. It's certainly a far cry from what I see from my window.
Uh,
Well, thank you,
After the
Richard, for that.
sanctuary.
Thank you for that little cook's tour of magnificent surroundings there. So why don't we begin our Q&A, Richard, with you giving our audience a brief overview of the book itself.
Um, the book is basically what I wanted to do is when I reunited my father with Kalman, I had never intended to write a book. And I am not an author. This is not something that I had planned on doing. But after taking some of their testimony and transcribing it, because I just wanted to get it down, I started realizing what I had. And it was very special because it's rare that you get two survivors of Auschwitz-Birkenau, both Mengele twins, they both had twin sisters, who are now together in this SS guard shack, and they're both recounting their stories. So it's kind of like seeing a car accident by two eyewitnesses. And they both have a different perspective of the actual same experience or the same events. And what happened is they ended up corroborating each other's stories. And so it took me on a journey of discovery, because it's one thing when you interview them and you hear their stories. It's another when you're reading it and you get it down in text. And then you can see how it lines up with some of the actual happenings during the historical information I got from Auschwitz or Yad Vashem, etc. And I realized at that point that I had something very rare. To have two boys tell you their story from inside an SS guard shack of Mengele's hospital camp, as well as going for their experiments, seeing the day-to-day operations of the camp. I'd never read anything like it, and I've read a lot of Holocaust books, seen a lot of documentaries. So I really felt that this was something very special.
Well, I can tell you, having read a good chunk of the book, it's extremely engaging and very compelling. And hats off to you, Richard, for doing that.
Thank you.
The book itself, there seems to be a bit of almost an organic relationship between the book and the 2001 film Leo's Journey. And I'd be interested to hear from you the relationship between the film and the book, and did the film help prompt you to write the book?
We made the film because, I was now getting to be in my late 20s, early 30s, and I never really knew my father's story. We knew little bits and pieces of it. Back in the 70s, who knew what Auschwitz was, who knew what who Mengele was, etc. So I wanted to know more. And so I approached Shel Piercy, and he said, we could make a documentary of this. So we made Leo's Journey, narrated by Christopher Plummer. We got broadcast Canada, parts of Europe, and in Israel. And that's when the lights came on. This man saw a picture of my father, and now he wanted to meet my father for some reason. I had no idea what was going on. And then one night I ended up at dinner with my mom and dad, and they had said, oh, this man called us from the camp that dad was in. He was a campmate with father. And they didn't tell me this before, and they just let it go. And dad was starting to get a little dementia. So at that point, I said, well, give me the email. I looked at the email. I contacted this man. We'd never heard of Kalman. Dad never spoke of him. He never talked about him growing up, never talked about him in his stories. And so I contact Kalman through email, and we start corresponding. And he starts telling me some of the things about dad that lined up with dad's experiences. So I'm going, this guy actually does know who my father is. And that's when I decided, let's reunite them. Let's bring Kalman to Vancouver. And that's when we brought them.
All the way from Tel Aviv.
Yes.
You begin the book, Richard, of course, with a fairly well-known quote by Elie Wiesel. It says, when you listen to a witness, you become a witness. I'd be interested to know, when you chose that quote, were you thinking of yourself or all those who would read the book, or maybe both?
Definitely both. It became apparent to me that the details that Kalman and my father would speak about were so organic and so real that it put me in their shoes. And I felt like I was experiencing what they were experiencing. And from that point of view, I looked at it and I said, this is something that I believe that young people will understand because it's in the voice of a 14-year-old and a 16-year-old. It's not a history book. It reads more like an adventure novel, and you feel like you're in the story. And it's something that I looked at and said, I feel like the children of today, the grade 10 students, 11 students, grade 12, that they would relate to something like this. It reads more like Anne Frank, where you feel like she's a friend. You feel that Kalman and Leopold could be a friend of yours. And that led me to believe, well, if you're witnessing this and reading this book, it could have that same type of effect. And so I believe that was the quote that I wanted to open with.
Now, you mentioned that it's not a history book, but it's very rich in historical information. And I'd be curious to know about the research that you put into the book and what were the main sources you used for that historical kind of basis that you used to complement the testimonies of Kalman and Leopold.
Well, it's kind of twofold. There are the institutions, the Yad Vashem, the U.S. Holocaust Museum, which I was able to get actual documentation of Father and Kalman, which if you go to the website, you'll see their actual documents with their names on these lists that Megaled created. We went to Auschwitz, got information from there. But what was really interesting was reading the other books of the other twin survivors that were also in the same barrack and Barrack 14. To read the books of In Our Hearts We Were Giants, which was a book written by the about the Seven Dwarfs, the Ovitz family. And in that book, they mention Kalman. And they mention Lajos Ludovitfeld, which we'll talk about in a minute. So Kalman is actually a figure that knows these other people. There's another book, He Didn't Know His Name, which was about Peter Grunfeld, who was a 4-year-old twin boy. And there was a book on him, very rare book. There's only like about 500, copies made. And I got a hand on that. In that book, Kalman is also mentioned. And in his statement, he says that he was looking for his Lipa, the son of his soul. This is back in 1991. He was looking for my father, quoted in this book. So I started using these other books. Dr. Miklos Nishli, who was Mengeles pathologist, and he accounts a day-by-day overview of what happened to him. Within his book, he talks about the uprising on October 7th of 1944. Of the Sonder Commando who blew up the crematorium number 4. And in that book, he talks about a transfusion with one Jewish patient for a German officer. My father was the Jewish patient. My father talks about being taken on October 7th to the crematorium number 2 in Auschwitz and having a transfusion to a German officer. So by doing all of this, I'm able to take all these other stories and help build out Kalman and Dad's story. And that's where a lot of the footnotes came from, the eyewitness accounts of other testimonies. So you don't have just Dad and Kalman saying this happened. You've got a whole group of these people that were in Barrack 14, and I've kind of melded them all together.
Well, you've clearly put an enormous amount of work into the book. That's quite evident when you read it. What was the hardest part actually for you in doing the book, and how long did it take?
It took about 5.5 years from the time I started, and it basically started because of COVID. And I looked at it and I thought that I'm going to go downstairs, clean up my studio, and I came across these 2 drives, which were the testimony of Kalman and my father. And I started transcribing that. And one of the things technically that was difficult was to understand all the different nuances of the language that they were using, because they're using Yiddish and Hungarian and a little Czech and Hebrew and broken English. So trying to understand, and I would go over one sentence like 25 times, and listen to it closely. And then there was the B-roll of Leo's journey, that when Dad was being interviewed, and remember, Dad's no longer around, that I couldn't ask him. And I found a guy that was very specific dialect of Hungarian. And I sent him the B-roll, and he then told me, this is what they're talking about. And this whole color of Dad's neighborhood came out. During the interview, Dad says it's not important. It's not related to what happened to him. But it was related in the sense of who was living across the street and the other boys in the neighborhood and the baker across the street and the candy store and all the other color of what their life was like. And the last part was inside the book. You'll see that there are a number of montages, a number of these pictures inside the book. And what I wanted to do was focus people on specific elements, because sometimes you'll look at the pictures and they're so large that you're not seeing the faces of the individuals. So I wanted to zoom in and capture the essence of who these people were. And what was really difficult was when I had to start cutting other people out of the picture, because I felt like I was taking their soul and not including them in the story. And after looking at close-ups of these children, close-ups of these mothers with their children, of these men, you got to, you're spending hours going over the editing process, and you feel like you have a relationship with them. And I think that was the hardest for me.
I think it's safe to say, Richard, that by far the most poignant moment in this entire story is the very emotional reunion of Kalman and Leopold 56 years after they left Auschwitz and went their respective ways. I want to talk to you about the reunion, but before we do, I want our audience to see an excerpt of a piece that the CBC did on TV in May of 2002. Chris is going to show it now.
How come we're going to feel like two brothers? Because we have so much to try and remember.
For 6 months, Leo Lowy and Kalman Baron spent almost every waking moment together. But those days have been pushed into a dark corner of Lowy's memory. It was Auschwitz, the Nazi death camp, the last months of World War II. A teenage Lowy was there with his twin sister, as was Baron and his twin sister. All four were subjected to the horrific experiments of Dr. Josef Mengele, nicknamed the Angel of Death. Of 3,000 twins, only 258 survived. Among them, the Lowys and the Barons.
Just touching it gives me the shakes.
2 years ago, Leo Lowy, now living in Vancouver, journeyed back to Auschwitz. His story and that of the so-called Mengele twins became a documentary film. It was shown round the world, including Israel, where Lowy's former bunkmate, Kalman Baron, now lives.
And then in the middle of the film, I find him and Miriam, his twin sister, at the age of 16. And I froze in my seat. That is my Lipa.
Him and I were chosen to be out in the morning at 5 o'clock at the SS barracks and polish their boots.
Lowy's son Richard produced the film and arranged the reunion.
Not only did he get a chance to close a chapter in his life, but to be reunited with someone that shared that exact experience with him, and to be able to now bring them together here in Vancouver.
For Kalman Baron, there isn't a single word that describes the emotions of the moment. It's happiness, but also...
It's tears, sadness, hurt, a whole gamut of things.
Do you want to remember those days?
I do. Each person is different. It is a function of our inner makeup. Each one of us is a different file. Get out of the ship.
Why did these two different men survive when so many died? Leo Lowy credits Josef Mengele. Mengele kept them alive for his experiments, and the war ended before he could kill them. Half a century later, that shared experience bonds Lowy and Baron. That's why they call each other brothers in fate.
It's an unbelievable experience because I never expected to hear from him. You shouldn't forget it's been 56 years. And when he called me the following morning after seeing the film, his opening remark was, "Please tell me that you're the guy that I'm looking for." I didn't know what he was talking about, and I said, "Who are you?" He says, "Well, I'm the guy that spent a miserable 8, 9 months with you in Auschwitz-Birkenau, and we were guinea pigs to this Dr. Mengele.
He was the guy who always saw what's coming and would hiss to me in Hungarian, "Careful, someone is coming." We did our jobs, and he was the braver. He taught me not to cry. Crying meant more slaps or kicks. I looked to him. He was my senior partner, if you wish, in modern parlance, amid all the horror and the difficulties. That's why I couldn't forget him. I've been looking for Leo all my life.
I have taken him as my brother in faith.
We are both here. We have families. We have found each other. Let life carry on. Never to forget what was.
I imagine for you, Richard, no matter how many times you see that, I'm sure it has such an impact. Interesting.
I miss my conversations. I miss my conversations with Coleman. You know, he was such an amazing storyteller, and the detail that he provided. Imagine someone coming to you after all those years, you know, and telling you your father was my hero.
I can only imagine. What was the experience of being at the reunion to witness that remarkable encounter after 56 years for your father and Kalman? What was it like for you to be there and then to spend some time with both of them?
It was fascinating. So Dad was about 74, Kalman was about 72, and they were reunited. And you could see them regressing into becoming these two boys again, and how they would playfully kibitz with each other. And my dad had this dark sense of humor. And it was just interesting to see how they got along and how it rekindled and the memory started coming out. So my father had early onset dementia, and he didn't kind of remember Coleman at the beginning. And slowly, as Coleman was telling stories, Dad would then pop up and say, "Oh yeah, he was a bastard. I remember him, you know, and how we would, you know, if we didn't do it right, he would smack you across the face and kick you." And I'm going, "Dad, you never spoke of Coleman. You never spoke of the guard shack. And all of a sudden now you're telling us that you were in this SS guard shack of Mengeles hospital camp for 6.5 months." Coleman opened up his eyes and made him remember all of this stuff. Dad just wanted to put it away. Dad wasn't there trying to make friends. He was there to survive and look out for Miriam. Coleman ended up being this nuisance for him when he first met him, because he felt that Coleman might say something or do something that would draw attention. My dad wanted to be invisible. He wanted to be at the back of the line. He didn't want to know somebody, because if you knew somebody, they could end up on the pile. And now you're emotional because you just met somebody, you got to know them, and now the next day they're on the pile.
Well, you touched on this a little bit already, but I'd like to ask you to elaborate. What was the impact on your father of this reunion? I know you said his condition was starting to deteriorate somewhat, but how did you perceive the impact on your father of the reunion itself?
Well, just to go back before the reunion, taking him back to Auschwitz was a huge thing. To go back to his home, to go into the house that he lived, to take him back. And he saw a ceramic oven, which was a warming hut that they used. And this is the first time that I can remember in my life where I actually saw him cry. So that was so emotional, because that was the first time that he really remembered his family, his sisters, and spoke of them. And now we meet Coleman, who brings back the memories of what it was like to be in the barrack, what it was like to be in the guard shack. And so for Dad, it just opened up his memory. And he just really appreciated, meeting Coleman again, because he had forgotten a lot of this stuff. And he didn't, not that he wanted to forget it, but it wasn't important to him. It wasn't important to him at the time. He had a sole focus of staying alive. And Coleman had a focus of wanting to remember, because he wanted to educate. He wanted people to know what he had been through. And you can see, and I don't know if you have the picture of them as the two younger boys, but you can see the mischievousness in my dad's eyes. And, he was always looking around. He was always watching. And Coleman was always naive. He didn't know it was coming, and Dad looked out for him, and slowly the relationship built. And I think for Dad, and he had said this, he worked with the Holocaust Memorial in Vancouver and the Vancouver
Which was
Holocaust.
where that photograph was, I believe. Excuse me for interrupting.
Correct.
I believe
Correct.
that photo of him was at the Vancouver.
And he worked, yes, and he worked on the board and the Vancouver Holocaust Educational Center, and he was very key in getting that up and going. And so he was very involved in the community, and he knew a lot of survivors. But he also said that they didn't understand his story because it was different. He was a Mengele twin, and they didn't really understand. They went through their own horror, yes, but they didn't understand the psychological horror on top of being experimented on, being brutalized. Kalman talks about, the day that one of the boys in the bed next to him goes off for a Mengele examination, and he comes back and he's got a bandage on his head, and they opened up his cranium, and then the capo came up to him and said, "You're going tomorrow." Imagine the absolute horrific, situation that you have to spend the night thinking the next morning you've got to go see this guy Mengele and what he's done to these other boys. For Dad meeting Kalman, it just was somebody that went through what I went through, the exact same experiences in the guard shack, in Mengele's experiments. And it just said to Dad, yes, those things did happen to me. I'm not crazy. Some people never believed these guys. When they came back from the camp, people would say, yeah, the experiments with that lady, she's this trash, Candace Owen, I think, who says, oh, the Mengele experiments, they made them all up. That's not possible. That couldn't possibly happen, those kind of things. It did happen. Here's eyewitness accounts. They were in the room. So she's going by, what she thinks. She has no clue.
Well, let's not even give her any time on this. You mentioned earlier, Richard, and I believe in the book as well, that while you were growing up, your father had never actually mentioned anything about Kalman. And of course, this contrasts tremendously with Kalman, who for decades was searching everywhere and anywhere for your father. And of course, they were so central to each other during their 7 or 8 months in Auschwitz. And I'd just be curious to ask you why you think your father was so reticent and did not ever allude to Kalman when did not share anything with you and perhaps the rest of your family about Kalman and what happened at Auschwitz.
Well, I want to be clear is that for Kalman and Leopold, it didn't start out as a friendship. It wasn't like, hey, we're best buddies and we're in Auschwitz and let's do this, we're going to be together. Dad wanted to be invisible. To Dad, working at the guard shack was no different than pushing a cart, working on the road, having to deliver stuff to the kitchen. These boys were assigned work tasks. They're in the labor camp. They got light labor because you couldn't hurt a Mengele twin. You didn't want to damage them. The only one that could kill you was Mengele. So everybody was very sensitive. Dad recalls a time when 2 drunk guards came up to them, and he was on a work detail with 3 other guys, and they started pistol whipping and butting them in with their rifles and beating the crap out of these guys. And Dad kept moving to the back. And when they came to Dad, he blurted out, Mengele, I'm a Mengele twin. And the guards stopped and they said, get out of here. So for Dad, it was another work detail. The guard shack was a work detail. That was it. Kalman was another boy that he worked with on a work detail. Most important for Dad was stay invisible. For Kalman, who was this naive boy that knew nothing, he shows up, after being in a yeshiva, and he doesn't read papers, he doesn't see the news. And he sees people like Ludovic Feld, who was in the barrack, and my dad as people that can look out for him. So all of a sudden, Dad became this rock for him, someone that could look out for him, tell him, be careful of the guard, don't do this, don't do that. in that sense, Dad took care of him and looked out for him, and they were friendly, and they became friendly. When Dad got out of Auschwitz-Birkenau, he wasn't thinking of Kalman. He wasn't thinking of the other boys on the work details or the other people in the barrack. Dad wanted to move forward with his life. He wanted to build a life. He wanted to have a family. He wanted to have a store, and that was his focus. And when he started talking a little bit about his Holocaust experience, and he tried when he was younger, he would wake up in sweats in the bed. And Mom said, you should not talk about this anymore, because he would have this trauma of memory. And there was one time when he had a heart attack and the paramedics came to the house and they couldn't get the gurney up the stairs. And you know, in the bedroom, when you have that wall of mirrors for the closet, Dad looks as these two uniformed paramedics are picking him up and carrying him out. And he looks in the mirror and he sees these two uniforms carrying him out. And again, for months later, I get shivers now, he would wake up in sweats. So Mom didn't want him to talk about it. He didn't want to talk about it. And the memories faded over the years. And then Kalman came into our lives, and it was just kind of like, now we get the full story of what happened. It's amazing. Kalman is really, Dad's testimony is about an hour long, an hour and a half long. So you'll read in the book and Dad will remember one thing and it's like one line. And then Kalman will read, 3 pages of exactly what went on. It was October, I think it was August 2nd. I think I have to recount. August 2nd was the liquidation of the gypsy camp. And Dad just remembers August 2nd, it was the liquidation of the gypsy camp. But Kalman starts, it's late in the evening, we're all in bed, and we start hearing the cries, and we start hearing the sounds of the trucks pulling up. We knew something was going on. And Ludovic says liquidation. I didn't know what that meant. We all got up from our bunks and we went outside the barracks and we could see the trucks pulling up into the gypsy camp that was beside us. And he goes into great detail describing what happened on that day. For Dad, it was one line. So for me, it was like, Kalman came in and he really brought the color and the empathy and the emotion to the story.
In the first part of the book, Richard, you have these separate chronological entries for Kalman and Leopold, this starting well before the war and then right into the war, and then as the persecution of the Jews intensifies by the Nazis. But you also have separate entries, again in a chronological fashion, of Mengele and his progress, if we can use that word, in terms of his career as a Nazi doctor. Why did you choose to do that format using Mengele's evolution concurrent to the evolution of Kalman and Leopold?
I felt that Mengele's story is equally as important to understand how he became who he was. So we go through how Dad and Kalman were young. We also go through Mengele as a young boy growing up, his education, his background, his influences. And we're seeing the influences of Kalman and Leopold, but now we're starting to see, who is Ottmar von Verschuur? I'm sure most of you don't know who Ottmar von Verschuur is. He was Mengele's professor in the University of Frankfurt, and he's the one that's indoctrinating him, Mengele, into the pseudoscience, the twin experiments. It wasn't Mengele that came up with the twin experiments. It was Ottmar von Verschuur, a university professor indoctrinating his students. And so what we see is how Mengele was molded to become who he was. And it was because of Ottmar von Verschuur who put Mengele into Auschwitz to send that information back to the university. And as we go through this, we see how Mengele and Kalman and Leopold all then intersect in Auschwitz-Birkenau, and what their different goals are, what their motivations are, and how Mengele was so dangerous in his thinking. And it wasn't just that, Mengele was a monster. He was a monster. But if you just put him and elevate him to this point where he was this, this evil monster and nothing like him in the world before, there were other doctors. The state of Germany had created an entire medical community of these monsters. Mengele just was the most recognizable and the most notable of them because of the twins and the experiments. But there was a number of brutal doctors doing the x-rays and brutalizing people, murdering women for their drug testing that they did. And so it was important to understand, who he was, so you could understand the banality of what these two boys faced.
I believe somewhere in the book, Richard, if I'm not mistaken, there's a reference to the proportion of people in the medical profession in Germany who joined the Nazi Party. Somewhere early in the book, I seem to recall. Does that ring any bells? It was a staggering number of how many of the actual medical profession in Germany were supporting the Nazis.
Hitler believed that the sickness was in the people and the culture of what Germany was facing, and that he needed the medical community. He said that we can fight the wars and we can win the wars or whatever, but if we do not cleanse our German blood, we have lost. And so for him, the medical community, out of all the other infrastructure for building Nazi Germany, was the most important to him, because he wanted that Aryan blood. He wanted that purification of the Aryan species, the Aryan race. And so he made it in a prestigious job, to be a doctor, to earn your medical degree, and to become part of that community to help heal the German people. And that's really where it came from, that all of these people now wanted to be doctors. It was such a prestigious career. Mengele was going to be a dentist. He wasn't starting off becoming a doctor. And then he was convinced by some school friends that going into hereditary science, being part of the Third Reich in helping to purify the race, this was the line that he decided he wanted to take.
Just a reminder to everybody, in a few minutes, we're going to take some questions from the audience for Richard. So please, if you haven't done so yet, if you have any questions for Richard, please put them in the chat box now. What are some of the significant moments that Kalman and Leopold actually witnessed during their time in Auschwitz? And do you know how they were affected by them?
Yeah. One of the most graphic for them was witnessing the selection process. There are, as Kalman would say, there's two different types of selection processes going on. There's the selection on the ramp, where they're looking for the labor, the twins, the doctors. So that's going on the ramp. A lot of people don't know that the doctors would be looking for other doctors, and they were finding some of the best doctors in all of Europe, and they were looking for the twins. And by this time, a lot of the young males had already been taken out. So you just had young boys, girls, women, and old people. So that's the first selection process. The second selection process is in the camps of the people that are being brutalized for labor. They're becoming walking skeletons, Muselmen, as they're called. And then there was a selection process to weed out all of these Muselmen for the next arrival. And Kalman would describe, the process of watching this lineup of people being taken out, and one man is taken out, and the son, tries to sneak his father back into the line, and the German officer sees that and then grabs the boy and says, "Fine, you want to be together? Now you're together." And they march them off to the gas chambers together. And they would take these people and put them into this barrack that was in the hospital camp, and they would collect them over a period of a few days, or a week. And when they got so many into this barrack, then the truck would pull up and they would pull these people out. And Kalman would describe how they would throw each other onto the back of these trucks. And you have walking skeletons throwing other walking skeletons who couldn't move off the ground. The Germans are beating them, and they're throwing them onto these trucks. And Kalman and Dad went. So Dad grabbed Kalman and said, "Come." And they were working in the guard shack, and they pulled him outside, and they stood between the electrified fence and the guard shack, and they watched the selection process up close, literally within 15, 20 feet of where they were standing. And they could see the faces of these people that they knew being thrown onto the trucks. And that was just, as Kalman says, you cannot describe how it burned in his inner soul, what was going on there, the inhumanity. He wanted to ask, the guards how they felt about what they were doing. And meanwhile, they would then go back into the guard shack. These guards would come back into the SS guard shack, and Dad and Kalman had to serve them lunch after watching what they just did.
Just two more questions, Richard, before we take some questions from our audience.
Can I just finish real quickly?
Yeah, sure.
Two more real quickly. October 7th, 1944, they witnessed the Sonder Commando uprising in Crematorium 4. Again, outside the barrack in the back, where the Sonder Commando, the ones loading the bodies into the crematoriums, blew up crematorium number 4. And then there was a big firefight with machine guns and guards showing up. And Dad and Kalman just stood there watching this whole thing go down. Eyewitness account of what happened. They witnessed the liquidation of the gypsy camp. We spoke about it a little bit. Again, eyewitness accounts of what was going on. And we've heard about it from historians, but rarely do we get to see a minute by minute explanation of how these things actually happened.
What surprised you in preparing this book, Richard?
The serendipity, the people that Kalman would meet as he went along, the story of how he met my father, the story of how he met Ludovic Feld, who ended up being his uncle in the barrack, a dwarf artist of Mengelas. The serendipity of how, when he was taken in Budapest off of the train ramp, when the train came in, not the this is just a train. He's coming back on holidays for the Passover, and he's going home, taking the train home. He's getting off in Budapest, and this is the day that the Hungarians are being taken over with the Germans, and they're collecting the Jews off the trains. And Kalman's taken, and he's locked in this army barracks with like hundreds and hundreds of Jews. And then a guard comes in 3 weeks later, calling his name, and he's taken to the office. He's given his papers, and he's told he can go home. And he's totally confused. He doesn't know why, out of all these Jews that are about to be transported to Auschwitz, he is solely picked out and told to get out. Turns out later that we learned that he was younger, and they weren't collecting the older boys at that time. So he got sent away. And so all of these little different serendipity things that happened, you couldn't write it. I couldn't make it up. And it was just interesting for me when I discovered all these things. The Christmas party, there's a book called the Hawker album, which shows Nazi officers about half a kilometer outside of Auschwitz eating blueberries, partying, and having entertainment. Kalman and Leopold are in the SS guard shack around Christmas time, and they're serving the guards while they have a party. There's music, there's schnapps, there's beers, the guards are getting drunk. My father is worried that something bad is going to happen, and it does. And the way they got themselves into that situation and how they survived it, it's just, you couldn't make it up. I was blown away of how this all came about. And then the facts of researching it verified all of this. So that was really quite something.
As part of the chronological format of the book, your last entry is dated October 7th, 2023, a date that I'm sure we're all familiar with. And you, of course, refer to the Hamas atrocities in southern Israel after the invasion of Gaza. Clearly, when you began work on the book, you could never have known these dark events of October 7th. As we all know, the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. I don't think it ruins anything for the audience to know that this is the last entry in the book. But I think it would be, I think it would add something if you were to read your father's words that you cite in this entry, which actually concludes the book on page 300.
So my father's words echo in my mind. Quote, every Jewish survivor carries a hidden fear, a silent understanding that it could happen again. We keep our wallets full of money, ready to run at a moment's notice. Unquote. But this time, it's different. We will not go silently into the night.
Wow, very powerful way to end that book. I said two more questions before we go to the audience. I'm just going to ask you one more, and then we'll go straight to the audience. And if you could try to keep your answer fairly brief, just in the interest of time, Richard. But I obviously want to ask you, what do you hope readers will take away from this book?
I think the story of Kalman and Leopold teaches us, and my father and Kalman's words is that when total despair happens, when everything goes wrong, and you're in this pit of this horrific experience, how you hold on to your humanity, how there were people that were taking a blanket off of someone who had died, and rather than keeping it for themselves, would put it on someone else. How Ludovic Feld would give a piece of his bread to Kalman and share his food, where food was sacred. Everything was sacred. And it also shows some of the people that didn't hold on to their humanity, and they were the criminals and the black market and everything else. But Kalman and my dad were able to hold on to that, the idea that they would take care of each other, they would look out for each other, they would try to look out for their sisters, regardless of what was going on around them and the brutality of what was happening. They held on to something that was dear, that was their inner soul, and I think it was Viktor Frankl, that you cannot take that away from us. You can take everything else away from us, but you cannot take that. And that showed itself again through the words of Kalman and Leopold. And I think that when you start reading this, that it's not me writing a book. It's the testimony of a 14 and 16-year-old boy. And I say, I know you say be brief, but I just want to finish with this, is that Anne Frank takes us into her mind, into her world. But unfortunately, the Holocaust stops when she's finished writing, because when the Germans come and take her, we don't hear the rest of the story. With Kalman and Leopold, from the voices of a 14 and 16-year-old boy, we now know what it's like to be inside the train, to be on the ramp, to be in the guard shack, to be in the barracks. And I think that it's an easy read. Not that it's not hard to listen to, but it's not a big history book with lots of facts and figures unless you want to read the footnotes. It's a story of a 14, 16-year-old boys told in their words.
Excellent. So let's go now to see what questions there are from our viewers. And I see, here's a question. We'll take this as the first one from Les and Hillary Schneeweiss. They ask, did the sisters survive?
Yes, both Kalman's sister, Judith, and dad's sister, Miriam, survived. There was always this kind of idea that if one twin died, they would take you and open them up. And one was a test subject, one was a control subject. And they would open them up to see the comparison. That was more on the identical twins. On paternal twins, it happened as well. But dad and Kalman and their sisters, Kalman's sister Judith and Miriam, were extremely fortunate that they didn't get sick or die from any of those injections. So their sisters lived as well.
Great. Here's a question from Gabriella. And she asks, did your father know Ernol, if I'm reading this correctly, it's a bit small, the text, Ernol Spiegel?
V. Spiegel. V. Spiegel was the
Well, it says
father
Ernol
of the
here.
twins.
I see.
V. Spiegel was the father of the twins, and both Kalman and my father knew him. If you read a lot of these books, these names would come up, like V. Spiegel, because he was a central figure that Mengele would use as a Hungarian twin with his sister. He was 29 years old. He spoke fluent German. He spoke Hungarian, so he could talk to the children. But Kalman was old enough, as was my dad, that Zvi Spiegel really dealt with the children like Pepe, like Peter Grunfeld, who were 4 years old, 5 years old, the really young ones, to make sure that they got a little more food, help them, and unfortunately also be the one to have to bring them to Mengele and take them in for their experiments. So they did speak of them in the book.
Okay. Lisa Albert asks, I was actually going to mention this in our concluding remarks, but I'll let you answer this one, Richard. She asked, where can we see the documentary Leo's Journey?
So if you go to the website Kalman and Leopold, and Kalman is spelled Kalman, but spell AND. Don't do the ampersand. Kalman and Leopold.com. At that, you'll come to an opening page. You can buy the book there. It'll take you to all the different websites, Apple, Amazon, etc. If you go to the top, you'll see it'll say videos. And if you go to the first video, it will show Leo's journey. And then if you scroll down, you'll see another video, which is the reunion video. And if you scroll down farther, you're going to see a video of Kalman and Leopold and get to see their personalities during one of the interviews as they tell their stories.
We have a question. I don't know if this is a question or more of a statement, but it's from Aubrey Lowenstein. And she writes, there is an interesting play called There Are Blueberries Here. It is about the Hocher photos, which were turned over to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and how the researchers pieced the whole story together. I saw a really good production of the play at the Berkeley Theater in California.
Yes.
I wonder, is there some theater group that could bring this play to Canada? I don't know if you can answer that, Richard.
I know of it, and the Hochner album is what I was talking about earlier, and that's what Kalman and Leopold experienced within the actual guard shack of all these guys partying. Whether or not they would bring it to Canada, no idea. I don't know that that's definitely not for me. I do a one-man presentation, which is kind of similar to what that is, with visuals, violin and a cello behind me, and I tell the story. I did it at the Canadian Museum of Human Rights on stage. I've done it in South Africa. I've done it in Europe. And it's like a one-man show. So it's very similar to what they're doing of telling that story, that periodic history. So.
Okay, great. I really wish we had more time, Richard, to take additional questions, but we always promise the viewers we try to keep it to an hour. So we'll have to wrap up those questions there. And this does really bring us to the close of this latest installment of FSWC's Book Talk series. I want to thank everyone for joining us. We had a great turnout this evening. And of course, special appreciation to you, Richard, for being our featured guest. If you're interested in purchasing Kalman and Leopold, and I recommend the book, it's available from all major online retailers, including Amazon. And I suggest you go to the website that Richard mentioned a few minutes ago. It's www.kalmanandleopold.com, where you can find more information about the book and where to purchase it. And as Richard just said, there are also videos there and photographs, and there's a wealth of content there. We hope you will be able to join us for our next edition of Book Talk, which will be taking place on September 10th. And our featured guest then will be Todd Diamond, and he'll be discussing with me his new book titled Pass the Trauma, Please, which is an unconventional telling of his Holocaust surviving father's story. As always, we invite you to send us your suggestions for future installments of Book Talk. If you have ideas of writers or books that have been published recently that you think will be of interest to our community, please do share them with us. So now, on behalf of Friends of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, I want to thank all of you again for being with us for this evening's edition of Book Talk. Thank you again, Richard. And everybody, I wish a good night. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.